endorsed the violence directed against Indian peoples as an essential aspect of colonial life. This attitude was as true of inclusive as exclusive societies, with the difference being that in the former, native peoples were incorporated into colonial society, while in the latter, tribes were pushed from the frontier. American historians once tied the existence of this free land directly to the development of democracy. But the frontier heritage encouraged the popular acceptance of forced labor, a system that was anything but democratic. Labor was the key to prosperity, and it was in short supply throughout the colonies. In a land where free men and women could work for themselves on their own plot of ground, there was little incentive to work for wages. The use of forced labor was one of the few ways a landowner could secure an agricultural workforce. More than half of the immigrants to 18th century British America arrived as indentured servants. Agents paid for the Atlantic crossing of poor immigrants in exchange for several years of service in America. But at the conclusion of their indentures, 18th century servants enjoyed considerably more opportunity than their 17th century counterparts. The chance of a former servant achieving a position of moderate comfort rose from 1 in 5 in 1700 to better than 50-50 by 1750, probably because of the rise in overall prosperity in the British colonies. 5.2.3 population growth and immigration. All the colonial regions of North America experienced unprecedented growth in the 18th century. In 1700, there were 290,000 colonists north of Mexico. 50 years later they had grown to approximately 1.3 million, an average annual growth rate of about 3%. Pre-industrial societies typically grew at rates of less than 1% per year, approximately the pace of Europe's expansion in the 18th century. High fertility and low mortality played important roles. Colonial women typically bore 7 or more children during their childbearing years. And blessed with an abundance of food, colonists enjoyed generally good health and relatively low mortality. But the British colonies grew far more rapidly than those of France or Spain. It was immigration that made the difference. Fearful of depleting their population at home, the Spanish severely limited the migration of their own subjects and absolutely forbade the immigration of foreigners. Dedicated to keeping their colonies exclusively Catholic, the French ignored the desire of Protestant Huguenots to emigrate. But the English dispatched an estimated 400,000 of their own countrymen to populate their North American colonies during the 17th and 18th centuries. Moreover, the British were the only colonial power to encourage the immigration of foreign nationals. William Penn was the first colonial official to promote the immigration of Europeans, in the 1680s sending agents to recruit settlers in Holland, France, and the German principalities along the Rhine River. Soon the leaders of other British colonies were emulating his success. Early in the century, a number of British colonies enacted liberal naturalization laws that allowed immigrants who professed Protestantism and swore allegiance to the British Crown to become free denizens, with all the privileges of natural-born subjects. In 1740 Parliament extended these provisions to all the British colonies by enacting a general naturalization law. Transatlantic migration made for colonies characterized by extraordinary ethnic diversity. First there were the Africans, the largest group to come to North America in the colonial period, larger even than the English. Forced relocation brought an estimated 600,000 to the colonies before the official end of the slave trade to the United States in 1807. Then there was the massive emigration from the northern British Isles squeezed by economic hardship. An estimated 150,000 Highland Scots and Protestant Irish from the Ulster region of Northern Ireland emigrated in the 18th century. German speakers were next in importance, at least 125,000 of them settling in the colonies. 5.2.4 Social class in New France. Landowning seigneurs claimed privileges similar to those enjoyed by their aristocratic counterparts at home. The Spanish system of encomienda and the great manors created by the Dutch and continued by the English along the Hudson River also represented attempts to transplant European feudalism to North America. But because settlers in most areas had relatively free access to land, these monopolies proved difficult or impossible to maintain. North American society was not aristocratic in the European fashion, but neither was it without social hierarchy. In New Spain the official criterion for status was racial purity. Españols, also known as gente de razón, occupied the top rung of the social ladder, with mestizos, mulattoes, and others on descending levels, and with Indians and African slaves at the bottom. In the isolated northern borderlands, however, such distinctions tended to blur, with castas enjoying considerably more opportunity. mestizos who acquired land might suddenly be reclassified as Españols. Even so, Spanish and French colonial societies were cut in the style of the Old World, with its hereditary ranks and titles. In the British colonies, the upper class was made up of large landowners, merchants, and prosperous professionals. Despite the lack of titles, wealthy planters and merchants of the British colonies lived far more extravagantly than the seigneurs of New France or the dons of the Spanish borderlands. What separated the culture of class in the British colonies from that of New France or New Mexico was not so much the material conditions of life as the prevailing attitude towards social rank. But British North America celebrated social mobility. The class system was remarkably open, and the entrance of newly successful planters, commercial farmers, and merchants into the upper ranks was not only possible but also common. There was also a large and impoverished lower class in the British colonies. Slaves, bound servants, and poor laboring families made up 40% or more of the population. For them the standard of living did not rise above bare subsistence. African American slaves stood apart from the gains in the standard of living enjoyed by immigrants from Europe. Their lives in America had been degraded beyond measure from the conditions that had prevailed in their native lands. The feature of the class system most often commented on by 18th-century observers was not the character or composition of the lower ranks, but rather the size and strength of the middle class, a rank entirely absent in the colonies of France and Spain. More than half the population of the British colonies, and nearly 70% of all white settlers, might have been so classified. Most were landowning farmers of small to moderate means, but the group also included artisans, craftsmen, and small shopkeepers. The colonial middle class enjoyed a standard of living higher than that of the great majority of people in England and Europe. As one economic historian has recently concluded, the British colonies were much better places to live, with probably a much higher standard of living than the mother country. 5.2.5 Economic growth and economic inequality. One of the most important differences among North American colonial regions in the 18th century was the economic stagnation of New France and New Spain compared with the impressive economic growth of the British colonies. Weighed down by royal bureaucracies and regulations, the communities of the French Crescent and New Spain never evidenced much prosperity. In 18th-century British North America, by contrast, per capita production grew at an annual rate of 0.5%. As economic growth increased the size of the economic pie, most middle and upper-class British Americans began to enjoy improved living conditions. Improving standards of living and open access to land encouraged British colonists to see theirs as a society where hard work and savings could translate into prosperity, thus producing an upward spiral of economic growth. At the same time, economic growth produced increasing social inequality. In the commercial cities, for example, prosperity was accompanied by a concentration of assets in the hands of wealthy families. In Boston and Philadelphia at the beginning of the century, the wealthiest 10% of households owned about half of the taxable property. By mid-century their share had risen to more than 65%. In the commercial farming region of Chester County in southeastern Pennsylvania, the holdings of the wealthiest 10% of households increased more modestly, from 24% of taxable property in 1700 to 30% in 1750, but the share owned by the poorest third fell from 17% to 6%. The general standard of living may have been rising, but the rich were getting richer and the poor poorer. The greatest concentrations of wealth occurred in the cities and in regions dominated by commercial farming, whether slave or free, while the greatest economic equality was found in areas of self-sufficient farming. Another 18th-century trend, however, stymied upward economic mobility in the countryside. As population grew and as generations succeeded one another in older settlements, all the available land eventually was taken up. Under the pressure of increased demand, land prices rose beyond the reach of families of modest means. And as a family's land was divided among the heirs of the second and third generations, parcels became ever smaller and more intensively farmed. Eventually, the soil was exhausted. This pattern was most pronounced. There were increases in the number of landless poor, as well as the disturbing appearance of what were called the strolling poor, homeless people who traveled from town to town looking for work or simply a handout. Destitute families crowded into Boston, which by 1750 was spending more than £5,000 annually on relief for the poor, who were required to wear a large red P on their clothing. In other regions, land shortages in the older settlements almost inevitably prompted people to move to the frontier in search of cheap or free land. 5.2.6 Colonial politics. the administration of the Spanish and French colonies was highly centralized. French Canada was ruled by a superior council. New Spain was governed by the Council of the Indies, which sat in Spain, with the viceroy in Mexico City exercising direct executive authority over all political affairs. Although local communities had informal independence, these highly bureaucratized and centralized governments left little room for the development of vigorous traditions of self-government. The situation in the British colonies was quite different. During the early 18th century, the British government of Prime Minister Robert Walpole assumed that a decentralized administration would best accomplish the nation's economic goals. With the exception of Connecticut and Rhode Island, both of which retained their charters and continued to choose their own governors, the colonies were administered by royally appointed governors. But taxation and spending continued to be controlled by elected assemblies. The right to vote was restricted to men with property. Yet the proportion of adult white males who qualified approached 50% in the British colonies. Proportionally, the electorate of the British colonies was the largest in the world. That did not mean that the colonies were democratic. The basic principle of order in 18th century British culture was the ideal of deference to natural hierarchy. The common metaphor for civil order was the well-ordered family, in which children were strictly governed by their parents, wives by their husbands. Members of subordinate groups, such as women, non-English immigrants, African American slaves, servants, and Indians, were not allowed to vote or hold public office. Moreover, for the most part, the men who did vote nearly always chose wealthy landowners, planters, or merchants to serve as their leaders. To educated British colonists the word democracy implied rule by the mob. Yet over the century there was an important trend toward stronger institutions of representative government. By mid-century most colonial assemblies in British North America had achieved considerable power over provincial affairs, sharing authority with governors. Because the assemblies controlled the finances of government, the purse strings, most royal governors were unable to resist this trend. The royal governors who were most successful at realizing their agendas were those who became adept at playing one provincial faction against another. All this had the important effect of schooling the colonial elite in the art of politics, not democratic politics, but the politics of patronage, coalition building, and behind-the-scenes intrigue. This would have important implications for the development of American institutions. 5.3 The cultural transformation of British North America. How did tension between Enlightenment thought and traditional culture lead to the Great Awakening? The same ships that transported European immigrants and European goods across the Atlantic could also transport new ways of thinking that historians call the Enlightenment. Inspired by the 16th and 17th century revolution in scientific thought represented by giants such as Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, and Newton, intellectuals in Europe and Great Britain became advocates for the power of human reason rather than spiritual revelation or mystical illumination as the sole way of discovering natural law. They sought to establish an authoritative canon of logic, ethics, and aesthetics, as well as political philosophy. In the 1690s, for example, Englishman John Locke proposed that individuals were endowed with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property and that the state existed to protect those rights. In New Spain and New France, colonial officials worked diligently to suppress such challenging ideas and writings. Cultural censorship in the French and Spanish colonies was effective because literacy was confined to a tiny minority of elite men. In the British colonies, by contrast, literacy was widespread. British colonial officials made little attempt at cultural censorship, and as a result these new ideas sparked a cultural transformation in 18th century British North America. 5.3.1 The Enlightenment challenge. The Enlightenment is a simple label for a complex movement encompassing many different thinkers with many different ideas. But Enlightenment writers shared some things in common. They were optimistic about the ability of the rational human mind to discover the natural laws that were thought to govern the physical world and human affairs. Coupled with their commitment to reason was their belief in progress. These themes were in stark contrast with the traditional emphasis of folk culture on the unfathomable mysteries of God and nature and the inevitability of human failure and disorder. Such thinking was most attractive to the British colonial elite, families experiencing rising prosperity. This group had good reason to believe in progress. They sent their sons to colonial colleges, the focal point for the dissemination of Enlightenment ideas. Harvard, established in 1636, remained the only institution of higher education in British America until 1693, when Anglicans established the College of William and Mary at Williamsburg. Puritans in Connecticut, believing Harvard was too liberal, founded Yale College in 1701. The curricula of these colleges, modeled on those of Oxford and Cambridge in England, were designed to train ministers, but gradually each institution changed to curricula influenced by Enlightenment thinking. By the 1730s, students were studying Newton and reading Locke, as well as other British Enlightenment texts. The best-selling book of the colonial era, not surprisingly, was the Bible. But in second place was a unique American literary form, the captivity narrative. The genre originated with the appearance of the sovereignty and goodness of God, Mary Rowlandson's tale of her captivity among Indians during King Philip's War. Another popular literary genre was the almanac, a combination calendar, astrological guide, sourcebook of medical advice, and farming tips that largely reflected the concerns of traditional folk culture. A mixture of traditional and Enlightenment views characterized the thinking of many colonial intellectuals. Edwards sought to defend traditional Calvinist doctrine, but he did so by employing the concepts of Enlightenment thought, in which he was very well read. Worrying, however, that the new thinking tended toward a philosophy of materialism, Edwards argued that natural law revealed the harmony of God creation. 5.3.2 A decline in religious devotion. As Enlightenment thinking gradually gained in popularity, religious commitment seemed to decline, much as Edwards feared. In the South, by the 1730s, only one adult in 15 was affiliated with a church. The Anglican establishment in the Chesapeake and the Lower South was institutionally feeble, its ministers uninspiring, and many families unchurched. Puritan churches in New England also suffered declining membership and falling attendance, and ministers began to warn of Puritanism's declension. By the second decade of the 18th century, only 1 in 5 New Englanders belonged to an established congregation. And among the churched, an increasing number began to question the Calvinist theology of election, the belief that salvation was the result of God's sovereign decree, that only a small number of men and women would be the recipients of God's grace. Many turned instead to the view that people had a natural ability to accept God's grace by developing their faith and doing good works. The dispute between advocates of free will and determinism was ancient, but the idea that men and women were not helpless pawns but rational beings who could actively shape their own destinies was strengthened by Enlightenment thinking. It became a force at Harvard and Yale in the first quarter of the 18th century, and soon a generation of ministers with more liberal ideas were taking positions in New England churches. Their ideas appealed to the same men and women attracted to Enlightenment thinking, those experiencing rising prosperity and social improvement. Among ordinary people in the countryside, however, especially among those in communities with narrowing opportunities, there was a good deal of opposition to these unorthodox ideas. 5.3.3 The Great Awakening. The first stirrings of a movement challenging the rationalist approach to religion occurred during the 1730s, most notably in the revival sparked by Reverend Jonathan Edwards in the community of Northampton. Edwards was a committed Calvinist and used his charged preaching style to attack liberal theology. But there was more to this movement than the power of a single preacher. Similar revivals soon broke out in other New England communities, as well as among German Lutherans and Scots-Irish Presbyterians in Pennsylvania. Not all the revivalists were Calvinists. Some promoted a theology that emphasized human choice. But the common thread was a complaint of spiritual coldness, of ministers whose sermons read like rational dissertations. People clamored for preaching that was more emotional. These local revivals became an intercolonial phenomenon thanks to the preaching of George Whitefield, an evangelical Anglican minister from England, who in 1738 made the first of several tours of the colonies. By all accounts, his preaching had a powerful effect. Even Benjamin Franklin, a religious skeptic, wrote of the extraordinary influence of his oratory after attending an outdoor service in Philadelphia where 30,000 people crowded the streets to hear him preach. This widespread colonial revival of religion, which later generations called the Great Awakening, was an American version of the second phase of the Protestant Reformation. Religious leaders condemned the laxity, decadence, and bureaucracy of established Protestantism and sought to reinvigorate it with renewed piety and purity. People undergoing the economic and social stresses of the age, unsure about their ability to find land, marry, and participate in the promise of a growing economy, like those in Northampton, found relief in religious enthusiasm. Among Presbyterians, open conflict broke out between the revivalists and the Old Guard, and in some regions the church hierarchy divided into separate organizations. In New England, where these factions were known as the New Lights and the Old Lights, the two sides accused each other of heresy. New Lights railed against liberal theology as a rationalist heresy and called for a revival of Calvinism. Old Lights condemned emotional enthusiasm as a lawless heresy. Itinerant preachers appeared in the countryside, stirring up trouble. Many congregations split into feuding factions, and ministers found themselves challenged by their newly awakened parishioners. The revivals began somewhat later in the South, first developing in the mid-1740s, reaching full impact in the 1760s. They not only affected white Southerners but also for the first time introduced many slaves to Christianity. Baptist churches of the South in the era of the American Revolution included members of both races and featured spontaneous preaching by slaves as well as masters. In the 19th century, white and black Christians would go their separate ways, but the joint experience of the 18th century awakening shaped the religious cultures of both groups. Many other unchurched colonists were brought back to Protestantism by revivalism. But a careful examination of statistics suggests that the proportion of church members in the general population did not increase during the middle decades of the century. While the number of churches more than doubled from 1740 to 1780, the colonial population grew even faster, increasing threefold. The greatest impact was on families already associated with congregations. Before the awakening, attendance at church had been mostly an adult affair, but throughout the colonies the revival of religion had its deepest effects on young people, who flocked to church in greater numbers than ever before. Church membership previously had been concentrated among women, leading Cotton Mather, for one, to speculate that perhaps women were indeed more godly. But men were particularly affected by the revival of religion, and their attendance and membership rose. 5.3.4 The politics of revivalism. Revivalism appealed most of all to groups that felt bypassed by the economic and cultural development of the British colonies during the first half of the 18th century. The New Lights tended to draw their greatest strength from small farmers and less prosperous craftsmen. Many members of the upper class and the comfortable, middling sort viewed the excesses of revivalism as indications of anarchy, and they became even more committed to rational religion. Revivalism sometimes had political implications. In Connecticut, for example, Old Lights politicized the religious dispute by passing a series of laws in the General Assembly designed to suppress revivalism. Judges sympathetic to New Light views were thrown off the bench, and others were denied their elected seats in the Assembly. The arrogance of these actions was met with popular outrage. By the 1760s, the Connecticut New Lights had organized themselves politically and, in what amounted to a political rebellion, succeeded in turning the Old Lights out of office. New Light politicians would provide the leadership for the American Revolution in Connecticut. Such direct connections between religion and politics were rare. There can be little doubt, however, that for many people revivalism offered the first opportunity to participate actively in public debate and public action that affected the direction of their lives. Choices about religious styles, ministers, and doctrine were thrown open for public discourse, and ordinary people began to believe that their opinions actually counted for something. Underlying the debate over these issues were insecurities about warfare, economic growth, and the development of colonial society. Revivalism empowered ordinary people to question their leaders, an experience that would prove critical in the political struggles to come. Conclusion. By the middle of the 18th century, a number of distinct colonial regions had emerged in North America, all of them with rising populations demanding that more land be seized from the Indians. Some colonies attempted to ensure homogeneity, whereas others embraced diversity. Within the British colonies, New England in particular seemed bound to the past, whereas the middle colonies and the backcountry pointed the way toward pluralism and expansion. These developments placed them in direct competition with the expansionist plans of the French and at odds with Indian peoples committed to the defense of their homelands. The economic development of the British colonies introduced new social and cultural tensions that led to the Great Awakening, a massive revival of religion that was the first transcolonial event in American history. Beginning in small communities like Northampton, Massachusetts, the revivals affected thousands of people, leading to a renewal of religious passions. Rather than resuscitating old traditions, however, the awakening seemed to point people toward a more active role in their own political futures. Those transformations added to the differences between the British colonies, on the one hand, and New Spain and the French Crescent on the other. Chapter From Empire to Independence. 1750, 1776. American Communities. The First Continental Congress begins. To shape a national political community. The opening of the First Continental Congress, held in Philadelphia in September 1774, did not bode well. One of the delegates moved that the session open with prayer, but others objected. John Adams's cousin and fellow Massachusetts delegate Samuel Adams leapt to his feet. He was no bigot, he proclaimed, and was willing to hear a prayer from any gentleman of piety and virtue who was at the same time a friend to his country. Putting aside their religious differences, the delegates agreed to ask a local clergyman to give the invocation. He took as his text the 35th Psalm, "Plead my cause, O Lord, with them that strive with me, fight against them that fight against me." The incident highlights the most important task confronting the First Continental Congress, strengthening their common cause without compromising their local identities. The delegates represented distinct colonies with traditions and histories as different as those of separate countries. Moreover, these lawyers, merchants, and planters, leaders in their respective colonies, were strangers to one another. Britain's North American colonies enjoyed considerable prosperity during the first half of the 18th century. So in 1765 British authorities thought it only fair that colonists shoulder some of the expense of the late Great War for Empire, the 7 Years' War, during which Great Britain soundly defeated France and forced the cession of the French North American colonies. But the new taxes and trade restrictions inspired resistance among the colonists. By the opening session of the First Continental Congress, peaceful protest had escalated into violent riot, and in an attempt to force the colonists to acknowledge the power of Parliament to make laws binding them, in all cases whatsoever, the British had proclaimed a series of repressive measures, including the closure of ports in Massachusetts and the suspension of that colony's elected government. In this atmosphere of crisis, most of the colonial assemblies elected delegates for a Continental Congress to map out a coordinated response. Despite their differences, during 7 weeks of deliberations the delegates succeeded in forging an agreement on the principles and policies they would follow in this, the most serious crisis in the history of the British North American colonies. At the outset they resolved that each colony would have one vote, thereby committing themselves to the preservation of provincial autonomy. Their most vexing problems they sent to committees, whose members could sound each other out without committing themselves on the public record. They added to their daily routine dinners, parties, and much late-night tavern hopping. And in so doing they began to construct a community of interest and friendship among themselves. These were the first tentative steps toward the creation of an American national political community. Communities are not simply local but can also be regional, national, and even international. In a town or village, feelings of association come from daily, face-to-face contacts, but for larger groups those connections must be deliberately constructed. In their final declaration the delegates pledged to firmly agree and associate, under the sacred ties of virtue, honor, and love of our country. They asked their countrymen to remember the poorer sort among them during the time of trouble they knew was coming. They demanded that patriotic Americans break off all dealings with those refusing to act, thus drawing a distinction between insiders and outsiders, one of the essential first steps in the construction of community identity. Patrick Henry, a Virginia delegate strongly committed to American independence, was exuberant by the time the Congress adjourned in late October. The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more, he declared. I am not a Virginian, but an American. He exaggerated the unity. It remained very much a work in progress. Local, provincial, and regional differences would continue to clash. But Henry voiced an important hope. In its attempt to force the colonists to pay a share of the costs of empire through taxation, Great Britain had sparked a revolt of both elite and ordinary colonists. The road to a shared community of interest among British colonists, distinguishing them from the mother country, was marked by milestones with legendary names: the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts. The violent events that would follow the First Continental Congress, the first clash of arms at Lexington and Concord, the Siege of Boston, and the Battle of Bunker Hill, would lead to a second session of the Congress. Reluctantly at first, then enthusiastically, the delegates would move toward independence. The difficult months and years of warfare would sorely test the imagined community of the United Colonies, and the differences among them would frequently threaten to abort the nation being born. But the sessions of the First Continental Congress Markedthemomentwhen Americans first began the struggle to overcome local differences in pursuit of national goals. 6.1 The 7 Years' War in America. What was the significance of the 7 Years' War for Great Britain, the British colonists, and the Indian tribes? Leaders of the British colonies made an early attempt at cooperation in 1754, when representatives from New England, New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland met to consider a joint approach to military challenges from the French and their Indian allies. Even as the delegates met, the first shots were fired in a great global war for empire pitting Great Britain against the combined might of France, Spain, and Austria. In North America, this would be the final and most destructive armed conflict between the British and the French empires. Ultimately, the war would decide the future of the vast region between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. It would also lay the groundwork for the conflict between the British and the colonists that led to the American Revolution. 6.1.1 The Albany Conference of 1754. The British Board of Trade convened the 1754 meeting in the New York town of Albany on the Hudson River. They wanted the colonies to consider a collective response to the continuing conflict with New France and the Indians of the interior. High on the agenda was the negotiation of a settlement with the leaders of the Iroquois Confederacy, who had grown impatient with colonial land grabbing. But as the negotiations began, behind the scenes real estate developers were bribing minor Iroquois chiefs, affixing their signatures on a deed for an enormous tract of land in Pennsylvania, and turning the meeting into a vehicle for the very abuses the British sought to correct. Angered by these manipulations, the official Iroquois delegation walked out of the conference, refusing all offers to join a British alliance. Despite this failure, the Albany Conference succeeded in adopting the Plan of Union put forward by Benjamin Franklin, a delegate from Pennsylvania. Franklin's proposal would have placed Indian affairs, Western settlement, and other items of mutual interest under the authority of a Grand Council composed of representatives elected by the colonial assemblies and led by a British-appointed president. Franklin was struck by the unity of the Iroquois Confederacy. It would be a very strange thing, he declared, if ignorant savages should be capable of forming a scheme for such a union, and yet a like union should be impracticable for 10 or a dozen English colonies. British authorities, however, were suspicious of the plan, fearing it would create a powerful entity they would have difficulty controlling. They had nothing to fear, for all the colonies rejected the Albany Plan of Union, fearful of losing their autonomy. The absence of cooperation would prove one of the greatest weaknesses during the subsequent war with the French. 6.1.2 France versus Britain in America. There were 3 violent flashpoints in the conflict between Great Britain and France for control of North America. First was the northern Atlantic coast, the ragged boundary between New France and New England. In 1713, France had ceded this region, known as Acadia, to the British, who called it Nova Scotia. To protect the ocean approach to their colonial heartland, the French constructed the port and fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. In 1745, during King George's War, New Englanders captured Louisbourg, but the French reclaimed it upon the settlement of that conflict in 1748. In 1749, the British established a large naval facility at Halifax in Nova Scotia, but worried about the loyalty of the 18,000 French-speaking Acadians of the province. The second flashpoint was the border region between New France and New York, extending from Niagara Falls to Lake Champlain, where Canadians and New Yorkers were rivals for the lucrative Indian trade. The French, who found it difficult to compete against superior English goods, resorted instead to military might, garrisoning fortifications on Lake George and at Niagara. In this zone, the strategic advantage was held by the Iroquois Confederacy. The third area of conflict was the Ohio country, the Trans-Appalachian region bisected by the Ohio River. The rich lands along the Ohio were a prime target of British land speculators and backcountry settlers, whom the French feared would overrun their isolated outposts and threaten their entire Mississippi trading empire. To reinforce their claim, in 1749 the French sent a heavily armed force down the Ohio River to ward off the British, and in 1752 they attempted to expel all British traders from the region. Then, in 1753, French-Canadian troops began the construction of a line of forts running south from Lake Erie to the headwaters of the Ohio River. In a direct challenge to the French claims in the West, the British government issued a royal charter for more than 200,000 acres to the Ohio Company, organized by London and Virginia investors. The Indian peoples of the Ohio country had interests of their own to defend. In addition to native inhabitants, the region had become a refuge for Indian peoples who had fled the British seaborne colonies. Most of the Indians of the Ohio country opposed further British expansion and wished to make the Appalachians into a defensive wall. Meanwhile, the Iroquois Confederacy continued the game of playing the British against the French. In the South, the Creeks attempted to carve out a similar balancing role for themselves among the British in the Lower South, the French in Louisiana, and the Spanish in Florida. These Indian confederacies saw it as in their interest to perpetuate the existing colonial stalemate. Their position would be greatly undermined by an overwhelming victory for either side. 6.1.3 Frontier Warfare. As the delegates to the Albany Conference conducted their business, they received news of the first clash with the French. Colonel George Washington, a young militia officer sent by the governor of Virginia to expel the French from the Upper Ohio, had been forced to surrender his troops to a French-Canadian force. The French now commanded the interior country from Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio, the junction of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. Taking up the challenge, in 1755 the British launched an effort to strike the French in all three zones. An army of New England militiamen succeeded in capturing two important French forts on the northern border of Nova Scotia. The British then began the systematic removal of the Acadian inhabitants. A substantial number of the Acadians ended up in Louisiana, where they became known as Cajuns. The Acadian expulsion, so similar to modern episodes of ethnic cleansing, is an infamous chapter in the British imperial record in North America. Elsewhere, the British military campaigns failed miserably. In northern New York, a large colonial force was repulsed by the French. And on July 9, 1755, Major General Edward Braddock's 1,500 British troops were ambushed and destroyed by a much smaller force of 600 Confederated Indian fighters supported by a mere 30 French Canadians. It was the worst military defeat of a British army during the 18th century. Full-scale warfare between Great Britain and France began the next year, 1756. This was truly a global war, fought in Europe, Asia, and America, and known to history as the 7 Years' War. The first 2 years were a near catastrophe for Great Britain. Indians raided backcountry settlements, killed thousands of settlers, and penetrated deep into the coastal colonies, throwing British colonists into absolute panic. French Canadians captured British forts in northern New York. The lack of colonial cooperation greatly hampered the British attempt to mount a counterattack. When British commanders tried to exert direct control over provincial troops, they succeeded only in angering local authorities. 6.1.4 The conquest of Canada in 1757. William Pitt, an enthusiastic advocate of British expansion, became Prime Minister of Great Britain. Pitt committed himself to the conquest of Canada and the final elimination of French competition in North America. Promising that the war would be fought at His Majesty's expense, Pitt secured colonial cooperation with a massive infusion of British currency and credit. He dispatched more than 20,000 regular British troops across the Atlantic. In combination with colonial militias, Pitt amassed more than 50,000 troops against Canada. This was unlike anything ever seen before in North America. The British were also effective at attracting Indian support. In 1758, at a conference with representatives of the Iroquois and the Ohio Indians held in the Pennsylvania town of Easton, British officials promised to establish clear and fixed boundaries between our settlements and their hunting grounds, so that each party may know their own and be a mutual protection to each other of their respective possessions. This succeeded in neutralizing a good deal of the Indian support for the French. Thus did Pitt succeed in reversing the course of the war. Regular and provincial forces captured the French fortress of Louisbourg in July 1758, setting the stage for the invasion of New France. A month later, a force of New Englanders captured the strategic French fort of Oswego on Lake Ontario, thereby preventing the Canadians from resupplying their western posts. Encouraged by British promises, increasing numbers of Indians deserted the French. The last of the French forts in northern New York fell in 1759. British forces now converged on French Canada. In 1759, colonial and British troops, acting on General James Wolfe's order to burn and lay waste the country, plundered farms along the St. Lawrence and shelled Quebec City. Finally, in an epic battle fought on the Plains of Abraham before the city walls, more than 2,000 British, French, American, and Canadian men lost their lives, including both Wolfe and the Marquis de Montcalm, the French commander. The British army prevailed, and Quebec fell. The next year another British force moved up the Hudson and conquered Montreal. Its fall marked the end of the French Empire in America. In the final 2 years of the war, the British swept French ships from the seas, conquered the Spanish colony of Cuba, captured the Spanish Philippines, and achieved dominance in India. In the 1763 Treaty of Paris, France lost all its possessions on the North American mainland, ceding to Great Britain all its claims east of the Mississippi, with the exception of New Orleans, which Britain agreed that France would pass to Spain, along with other French claims to the huge Trans-Mississippi region. In exchange for the return of its Caribbean and Pacific colonies, Spain ceded Florida to Britain. 3 centuries of European imperial rivalry in eastern North America ended with complete victory for the British Empire. See Map 6.2. 6.1.5 The struggle for the West. The Ohio Indians were shocked when told of the French cession. A new set of British policies soon shocked them even more. The French and the British had long used gift-giving as a way of gaining favor with Indians. But in one of his first official acts, General Jeffrey Amherst, British military governor of the Western region, banned presents to Indian chiefs and tribes. Not only were Indians angered by Amherst's policy, but they were also frustrated by his refusal to supply them with the ammunition they needed for hunting. Many were left destitute. In this climate, hundreds of Ohio Indians became disciples of an Indian visionary named Nealon, known to the English as the Delaware Prophet. The core of Nealon's teaching was that Indians had been corrupted by European ways and needed to purify themselves by returning to their traditions and preparing for a holy war. In the spring of 1763, a confederacy of tribes inspired by Nealon's ideas laid plans for a coordinated attack on British frontier posts. The principal leader of this resistance was an Ottawa chief named Pontiac, renowned as an orator and political leader. "We tell you now," Pontiac declared to British officials, "the French never conquered us, neither did they purchase a foot of our country, nor have they a right to give it to you." In May 1763, Pontiac's alliance simultaneously attacked all the British posts in the West, destroying 8 of them, but failing to take the key forts at Niagara, Detroit, and the forks of the Ohio River. Pontiac and his followers fought on for another year, but most Indians sued for peace. They were encouraged by the announcement of the British Royal Proclamation of 1763, which, in keeping with the promise made in the Treaty of Easton, declared the Trans-Appalachian region to be Indian country, reserved as a homeland for the Indian nations. British settlers had expected that the removal of the French threat would allow them to move into the West, but under the terms of the Royal Proclamation, specific authorization from the Crown was now required for any movement onto protected Indian lands. Settlers were outraged that the British would award territory to mortal enemies who had slaughtered more than 4,000 colonists during the war. In an act emblematic of the anger backcountry settlers felt about these restrictions, in December 1763 a mob of backcountry Pennsylvanians, calling themselves the Paxton Boys, butchered 20 Christian Indians at the small village of Conestoga on the Susquehanna River. When colonial authorities attempted to arrest the murderers, 600 frontiersmen marched on Philadelphia in protest. Negotiations led by Benjamin Franklin helped prevent a bloody confrontation. In fact, the British proved unable and ultimately unwilling to prevent the westward migration that was a dynamic part of the colonization of British North America. In response to demands by settlers and speculators, British authorities were soon pressing the Iroquois and Cherokees for cessions of land in Indian country. No longer able to play off rival colonial powers, Indians were reduced to a choice between compliance and resistance. Weakened by the recent war, they chose to sign away lands. In the Treaty of Hard Labor in 1768, the Cherokees ceded a vast tract on the upper Tennessee River, where British settlers had already planted communities. In the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, signed the same year, the Iroquois gave up their claim to the Ohio Valley, hoping thereby to deflect English settlement away from their own homeland in New York. The individual colonies were even more aggressive. Locked in a dispute with Pennsylvania about jurisdiction in the Ohio country, in 1773 Virginia Governor John Murray, Earl of Dunmore, sent a force to occupy Fort Pitt. In 1774, in an attempt to gain legitimacy for his dispute with Pennsylvania, Dunmore provoked a frontier war with the Shawnees. After dealing them a humiliating defeat, Dunmore forced them to cede the upper Ohio River Valley to Virginia. The Ohio Indians angrily complained about the outcome of Dunmore's War. The king, they argued, had guaranteed that the boundary between colonial and Indian land should forever after be looked upon as a barrier between us. But the Americans entirely disregard and despise the settlement agreed upon by their superiors and us, and, despite the agreement, are come in vast numbers to the Ohio, and gave our people to understand that they would settle wherever they pleased. If this is the case, we must look upon every engagement you made with us as void and of no effect. The continuing struggle for the West would be an important issue in the coming revolutionary struggle. 6.2 The emergence of American nationalism. What factors led to the growth of American nationalism in the 1760s? No colonial power of the mid-18th century could match Britain in projecting imperial power over the face of the globe. During the years following its victory in the 7 Years' War, Britain turned confidently to the reorganization of its North American empire. The new colonial policy plunged British authorities into a new and ultimately more threatening conflict with the colonists, who had begun to develop a sense of a separate identity. 6.2.1 An American identity. Despite the anger of frontier settlers over the Proclamation of 1763, the conclusion of the 7 Years' War left most colonists proud of their place in the British Empire. But many people had begun to note important contrasts between themselves and the mother country. The arrival of thousands of British troops raised the problem of where to house them. British commanders demanded they be quartered in private homes. British subjects at home were protected against such demands by an Act of Parliament, but that protection had expressly not been extended to the colonies. Americans who were thrown into contact with regular British troops were shocked by their profanity, lewdness, and violence. They were equally shocked by the swift and terrible punishment inflicted by aristocratic officers to keep those men in line. A Massachusetts militiaman wrote of witnessing the punishment of 2 soldiers sentenced to 800 lashes apiece. The flesh appeared to be entirely whipped from their shoulders, and they hung as mute and motionless as though they had long since been deprived of life. Men who witnessed such scenes found it easy to believe the danger of British slavery. Colonial forces, by contrast, were composed of volunteer companies. Militia officers were moderate in the administration of punishment, knowing they had to maintain the enthusiasm of their troops. Discipline thus fell considerably below the standards to which British officers were accustomed. Riffraff, one British general labeled colonial troops, the lowest dregs of the people, both officers and men. Americans believed British scorn blinded them to the important role played by the colonists in the 7 Years' War. It was during the 7 Years' War that many colonists began to view themselves as having an identity distinct from the British. The 7 Years' War also strengthened a sense of intercolonial unity among the colonists. Farm boys who never before had ventured outside the communities of their birth fought in distant regions with men from other colonies. Such experiences reinforced a developing sense of national community. This sentiment built on previous developments, including the growth of intercolonial commerce, which involved the movement of people as well as goods. 6.2.2 The press, politics, and republicanism. One of the most important means of intercolonial communication was the weekly newspaper. Early in the century, the colonial press had functioned as a mouthpiece for British officialdom. But a bold stroke for freedom of the press was struck in 1735 when a New York City jury acquitted editor John Peter Zenger of seditious libel after he printed anti-government articles. Newspapers became a lively means of public discourse, and by 1760 more than 20 weekly papers were being published in the British colonies. The papers carried an increasing amount of colonial news. From the 1730s to the 1770s, intercolonial coverage in the colonial press increased sixfold. Editors began to look at events from what they called a continental perspective. This trend accelerated during the 7 Years' War, when communities demanded news of the distant places where their men were fighting. Thus did the war promote a new spirit of nationalism and a wider notion of community. Editors began using the term American to denote the common identity of British colonists. Colonial editors frequently reprinted writings by British authors, including poems by Alexander Pope, satiric essays by Jonathan Swift, and political philosophy by John Locke. They also frequently reprinted political essays by British Republicans, who warned of the growing threat to liberty posed by the unchecked exercise of state power. Some essayists suggested that a conspiracy existed among European monarchs, aristocrats, and Catholics to quash liberty and reinstitute tyranny. These ideas came to define a political consensus in the British colonies, a point of view that came to be called republicanism. Republicanism asserted that state power, by its very nature, was antithetical to liberty and, consequently, had to be limited, that the authority of rulers should be conditional rather than absolute, and that the people had an inherent right to withdraw their support from the government if it did not fulfill their expectations, and organize a new one. The best guarantee of good government, Republicans argued, was a broad distribution of power to the people, who could not only select their own leaders but also vote them out of office. The theory of Republican government relied on the virtue of the people, on their willingness to make the stability and justice of the political community their first priority. But that kind of virtue was possible only for an independent population in control of its own affairs. This was a political theory that fit well with the circumstances of American life, with its wide base of property ownership, its tradition of representative assemblies, and its history of struggle with royal authority. Contrast the assumptions of Republicans with those of British monarchists, who argued that the good society was one in which a strong state, controlled by a hereditary elite, kept a vicious and unruly people in line. 6.2.3 The Sugar and Stamp Acts. The emerging sense of American political identity was soon tested by British measures designed to raise revenue in the colonies. During the decade from 1764 to 1774, the British Parliament passed a series of acts that progressively led the American colonists toward revolution. At the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, the British decided to keep 10,000 regular troops stationed in North America. The cost of maintaining this force added to the enormous debt run-up during the fighting. In 1764, Prime Minister George Grenville decided to obtain the needed revenue from American colonists. Parliament passed a measure known as the Sugar Act, which placed a tariff on sugar imported into the colonies. Anticipating that American importers would attempt to avoid the duty by smuggling, Parliament also broadened the jurisdiction of the Vice Admiralty Court at Halifax, which had jurisdiction over customs cases. Both merchants and artisans viewed the Sugar Act as a threat to their livelihoods, and there were public protests in many port towns. The residents of Boston were especially vocal. The town meeting proposed a boycott of certain English imports, and the tactic of non-importation soon spread to other port towns. James Otis, a brilliant Massachusetts lawyer, became one of the first Americans to give voice to these protests, striking a number of themes that were repeated many times over the next 15 years. Every man, Otis declared, in rhetoric lifted directly from the Great Awakening, was an independent sovereign, subject to no law but the law written on his heart and revealed to him by his Maker. No government, he argued, using the logic of British republicanism, could rightfully deprive a man of the right to his life, his liberty, and his property. Otis's most memorable phrase would echo throughout the subsequent decade: taxation without representation is tyranny. 6.2.4 The Stamp Act crisis. Ignoring American protests, in early 1765, Grenville pushed through a considerably more sweeping revenue measure known as the Stamp Act. This legislation required the purchase of specially embossed paper for all newspapers, legal documents, licenses, insurance policies, ships' papers, even dice and playing cards. It affected nearly every colonial resident in one way or another. The American reaction to the Stamp Act during the summer and autumn of 1765 created a crisis of unprecedented proportions. Many colonists complained of being miserably burdened and oppressed with taxes. But constitutional objections had more importance over the long term. Although colonial male property owners elected their own assemblies, they could not vote in British elections and had no representatives in Parliament. The British government argued that colonists were still subject to the Acts of Parliament because of what they termed virtual representation. Americans did not take well to this analogy. They argued instead for actual representation, emphasizing the direct relationship that should exist between the people and their political leaders. Just such constitutional issues were emphasized in the Virginia Stamp Act resolutions, written by Patrick Henry, a passionate young backcountry lawyer and member of the House of Burgesses. Although Henry's colleagues rejected the most radical of his resolutions, all of them were reprinted in the colonial press. By the end of 1765, the assemblies of 8 other colonies had approved similar measures denouncing the Stamp Act and proclaiming their support of no taxation without representation. The most violent protests took place in Boston. The city's elite had prospered over the previous decade, but conditions for workers and the poor had worsened. Ordinary Bostonians were resentful. Their discontent was channeled by Samuel Adams, the son of a brewer, who became a powerful local politician. Adams organized an anti-British alliance that spanned Boston's social classes. In the late summer of 1765 he and his associates organized a protest of Boston workingmen. On August 14 a large crowd assembled near Boston Common, and in an old elm, known as the Liberty Tree, strung up effigies of several British officials, including Boston's stamp distributor, Andrew Oliver. The restless crowd then invaded and vandalized Oliver's office as well as his home. Soon thereafter, Oliver resigned his commission. Several days later another mob broke into the mansion of Thomas Hutchinson, lieutenant governor of the colony. During the fall and winter, urban crowds protested in port towns from Halifax in the north to Savannah in the south. Growing alarmed at the rising potential for violence, merchants, lawyers, and respectable craftsmen gained control of the resistance movement. Calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, these leaders encouraged more moderate forms of protest, such as circulating petitions and publishing pamphlets. There were few repetitions of mob attacks, but by the end of 1765 almost all the stamp distributors had resigned or fled, making it impossible for Britain to enforce the Stamp Act. Pressured by British merchants, who worried over the effects of the growing non-importation movement among the colonists, in March 1766 Parliament repealed the Stamp Act and reduced the duties under the Sugar Act. Overlooked, however, was the fact that Parliament coupled repeal with what was termed a declaratory act, affirming its full authority to make laws binding the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. The Declaratory Act signaled that the conflict between the mother country and the colonies had not been resolved but merely postponed. 6.3 Save your money and save your country. What was behind the growth of American resistance to British colonial policy? Colonial resistance to the Stamp Act was stronger in urban than in rural communities, stronger among merchants, craftsmen, and planters than among farmers and frontiersmen. When Parliament next moved to impose its will, as it had promised to do in the Declaratory Act, the American opposition again adopted the tactic of non-importation. But this time resistance spread from the cities and towns into the countryside. As the editor of the Boston Gazette phrased the issue, "Save your money, and you save your country." It became the slogan of the movement. 6.3.1 The Townshend Revenue Act's the foremost problem facing the new British government in the mid-1760s was the national debt. Britain suffered massive unemployment, riots over high prices, and tax protests. Fearing opposition at home more than protest in the colonies, in June 1767, Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend proposed a new series of Townshend Revenue Acts placing tariffs on the importation of commodities such as lead, glass, paint, paper, and tea into the colonies. The most influential colonial response came in a series of articles by wealthy Philadelphia lawyer John Dickinson, which were reprinted in nearly every colonial newspaper. Posing as a humble farmer, Dickinson argued that Parliament had no constitutional authority to tax goods in order to raise revenue in America. Other Americans warned that the Revenue Acts were part of a British conspiracy to suppress American liberties. Their fears were reinforced by stringent enforcement. In response, some colonists argued for violent resistance. But it was Dickinson's essays that had the greatest effect on the public debate, not only because of their convincing arguments but also because of their mild and reasonable tone. "Let us behave like dutiful children," Dickinson urged, "who have received unmerited blows from a beloved parent." Very little sentiment for independence yet existed in the British colonies. 6.3.2 An early political boycott. In October 1767 the Boston Town Meeting revived the tactic of non-importation, drawing up a long list of British products to boycott. Over the next few months other port cities set up non-importation campaigns of their own. Artisans took to the streets in towns and cities throughout the colonies to pressure merchants to stop importing British goods. Uncooperative importers and retailers became the object of protesters. Coercion was very much a part of the movement, and there was occasional violence. Protesters formed non-importation associations, pledging to curtail luxuries and stimulate local industry. These aims had great appeal in small towns and rural districts, which previously had been uninvolved in the anti-British struggle. In 1768 and 1769, colonial newspapers paid a great deal of attention to women's support for the boycott. Groups of women, some calling themselves Daughters of Liberty, organized spinning and weaving bees to produce homespun for local consumption. Other women renounced silks and satins and pledged to stop serving tea to their Husbands. Non-importation was greatly strengthened in May 1769 when the Virginia House of Burgesses enacted the first provincial legislation banning the importation of goods enumerated in the Townshend Acts. Over the next few months all the colonies but New Hampshire enacted similar legislation. Because of these efforts, the value of colonial imports from Britain declined by 41% over the next year. 6.3.3 The Massachusetts Circular Letter. Boston and Massachusetts were at the center of the agitation over the Townshend Revenue Acts. In February 1768 the Massachusetts House of Representatives approved a letter drawn up by Samuel Adams and addressed to the speakers of the other colonial assemblies. The letter denounced the Revenue Acts, attacked the British plan to make royal officials independent of colonial assemblies, and urged the colonies to find a way to harmonize with each other. Massachusetts Governor Francis Bernard condemned the document for stirring up rebellion and dissolved the legislature. In Britain, Lord Hillsborough, Secretary of State for the Colonies, ordered each royal governor in America to dissolve his colony's assembly if it should endorse the letter. Before this demand reached America, the assemblies of New Hampshire, New Jersey, and Connecticut had commended Massachusetts. Virginia, moreover, had issued a circular letter encouraging a hearty union among the colonies and urging common action against the British measures. Throughout this crisis there were rumors and threats of mob rule in Boston. Because customs agents pressed on smugglers and honest traders alike, they enraged merchants, seamen, and dockworkers. John Hancock, reportedly the wealthiest merchant in the colonies, and a vocal opponent of the British measures, was a principal target of the customs officers. In June 1768 a crowd assaulted customs officials who had seized Hancock's sloop Liberty for non-payment of duties. So terrorized were the officials that they fled the city. In September, the Boston town meeting called on the people to arm themselves and issued an invitation for all the colony's towns to send delegates to a provincial convention. Although a number of delegates made threats of armed resistance, they received little support and the convention broke up in chaos. Fearful of insurrection, on October 1, 1768, the British occupied Boston with infantry and artillery regiments. This action added greatly to the growing tensions. 6.3.4 The Boston Massacre. The British troops stationed in the colonies were the object of scorn and hostility over the next 2 years, and there were a number of violent confrontations. A persistent source of conflict was the competition between troops and townsmen over jobs. Soldiers were permitted to work on the days they were off duty, thus competing with poor day laborers. In early March 1770 a British soldier walked into a Boston rope walk in search of a job. "You can clean my shithouse," the scornful owner told him. The soldier later returned with some of his friends and a small riot resulted. Over the next few days sporadic fighting between soldiers and townsmen continued in the streets between the wharf and the common, where the soldiers were encamped. Finally, on the evening of March 5, 1770, a crowd at the customs house began taunting a guard. A captain and a company of 7 soldiers went to his rescue, only to be pelted with snowballs and stones. Suddenly someone shouted, "Fire," and the frightened soldiers shot indiscriminately into the crowd. 5 men fell dead and 6 were wounded, 2 of them mortally. The soldiers escaped to their barracks, but a mob numbering in the hundreds rampaged through the streets demanding vengeance. What became known as the Boston Massacre was soon infamous throughout the colonies. For many colonists the incident was a disturbing reminder of the extent to which relations with the mother country had deteriorated. During the next 2 years many people found themselves pulling back from the brink. The growth of American resistance was slowed as well by the news that Parliament had repealed most of the Revenue Acts. In the climate of apprehension and confusion, there were few celebrations of the repeal, and the non-importation associations almost immediately collapsed. The parliamentary retreat on the question of duties, like the earlier repeal of the Stamp Act, was accompanied by a face-saving measure, retention of the tax on tea. 6.4 From resistance to rebellion. What explains the colonists' shift from resistance to outright rebellion? There was a lull in the American controversy during the early 1770s, but the situation turned violent once again in 1773, when Parliament infuriated the Americans by passing an ill-advised tax on tea. The tax pushed the colonists onto a fast track from resistance to outright rebellion. 6.4.1 Committees of Correspondence. In June 1772, Governor Hutchinson of Massachusetts inaugurated another controversy by announcing that henceforth his salary and those of other royally appointed officials would be paid by the Crown. In effect, this made the executive and judiciary branches of the colony's government independent of control by elected representatives. In October, the Boston Town Meeting appointed a committee of correspondence to communicate with other communities regarding this challenge. In March 1773, the Virginia House of Burgesses appointed a standing committee of correspondence to obtain the most early and authentic intelligence of British actions affecting America, and to keep up and maintain a correspondence and communication with our sister colonies. The Virginia Committee served as a model for the other colonies, and within a year all but Pennsylvania had created committees of their own. The committees of correspondence became the principal channel for sharing information, shaping public opinion, and building cooperation among the colonies before the opening meeting of the First Continental Congress in 1774. The information most damaging to British influence came from the radicals in Boston. In June 1773, the Boston Committee circulated a set of confidential letters from Governor Hutchinson to the ministry in Britain. The letters revealed the governor's call for an abridgment of what are called English liberties in the colonies. His statement appeared to be the smoking gun of the conspiracy theory, and it created a torrent of anger against the British and their officials in the colonies. 6.4.2 The Boston Tea Party. It was in this context that the colonists received the news that Parliament had passed the Tea Act. Colonists were major consumers of tea, typically drinking from 5 to 10 cups a day. But because of the Townshend duties, the market for tea had collapsed. The British East India Company, the sole agent of British power in India, was on the brink of bankruptcy. Parliament considered it too big to fail, and devised a scheme to offer tea to Americans at prices that would tempt even the most patriotic drinker. The radicals argued that this was merely a device to make palatable the payment of unconstitutional taxes and further evidence of the British effort to seduce and corrupt the colonists. In October 1773, a mass meeting in Philadelphia denounced anyone importing the tea as an enemy of his country. A group calling itself the Committee for Tarring and Feathering published a broadside threatening captains whose ships carried British tea. The Philadelphia consignees resigned in terror. Similar protests in New York City forced resignations there as well. The town meeting in Boston soon passed resolutions patterned on those of Philadelphia. The first of 3 tea ships arrived in Boston Harbor late in November. Mass meetings in Old South Church, including many country people drawn to the scene of the crisis, resolved to keep the tea from being unloaded. On the evening of December 16, 1773, 5,000 people crowded into the church to hear the captain of one of the vessels report to Sam Adams that Governor Hutchinson had issued orders that the ship was to remain docked at the wharf. "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country," Adams declared. This was the signal for a disciplined group of 50 or 60 men to march to the wharf. Dressed as Indians and cheered on by Boston citizens, they boarded the ships and dumped into the harbor some 45 tons of tea, valued at £18,000. The Boston Tea Party was the first tea party, and other incidents of property destruction soon followed. But it was the initial action in Boston that infuriated the British. The government became convinced that something had to be done about the rebellious colony of Massachusetts. Strong measures were required. King George III wrote to Lord North, "For we are now to dispute whether we have, or have not, any authority in that country." 6.4.3 The Intolerable Acts. During the spring of 1774, an angry Parliament passed a series of acts, officially called the Coercive Acts but known by Americans as the Intolerable Acts, calculated to punish the colony of Massachusetts and strengthen the British hand. The Boston Port Bill prohibited the loading or unloading of ships in any part of Boston Harbor until the town fully compensated the East India Company and the Customs Service for the destroyed tea. The Massachusetts Government Act annulled the colonial charter. Delegates to the upper house would no longer be elected by the Assembly but henceforth were to be appointed by the king. Civil officers throughout the province were placed under the authority of the royal governor, and the selection of juries was given over to governor-appointed sheriffs. Town meetings, an important institution of the resistance movement, were prohibited from convening more than once a year except with the approval of the governor, who was placed in control of their agendas. With these acts, the British terminated the long history of self-rule by communities in the colony of Massachusetts. Additional measures affected the other colonies and encouraged them to see themselves in league with suffering Massachusetts. The Administration of Justice Act protected British officials from colonial courts, thereby encouraging them to pursue the work of suppression. Those accused of committing capital crimes while putting down riots or collecting revenue, as in the Boston Massacre, were now to be sent to England for trial. The Quartering Act legalized the housing of troops at public expense not only in taverns and abandoned buildings but also in occupied dwellings and private homes. Finally, in the Quebec Act, the British authorized a permanent government for the territory taken from France during the 7 Years' War, a strictly anti-republican government with an appointed council. It confirmed the feudal system of land tenure along the St. Lawrence. The Act also granted religious toleration to the Roman Catholic Church and upheld the Church's traditional right to collect tithes, in effect endorsing Catholicism as the state religion of Quebec. To the American colonists it seemed a frightening preview of what imperial authorities had in store for them, and it confirmed the contention of the Committees of Correspondence that there was a British plot to destroy American liberty. In May, General Thomas Gage arrived in Boston to replace Hutchinson as governor. 6.4.4 The First Continental Congress. It was amid this crisis that town meetings and colonial assemblies alike chose representatives for the First Continental Congress. The delegates who arrived in Philadelphia in September 1774 included the most important leaders of the American cause. Cousins Samuel and John Adams from Massachusetts were joined by Patrick Henry and George Washington of Virginia and Christopher Gadsden of South Carolina. Many of the delegates were conservatives, including John Dickinson and Joseph Galloway of Philadelphia, and John Jay and James Duane from New York. After one of their first debates, the delegates passed a declaration and resolves, asserting that all the colonists sprang from a common tradition and enjoyed rights guaranteed by the immutable laws of nature, the principles of the English Constitution, and the several charters or compacts of their provinces. 13 Acts of Parliament, passed since 1763, were declared in violation of these rights. Until these acts were repealed, the delegates declared, they were imposing a set of sanctions against the British. These included not only the non-importation and non-consumption of British goods but also a prohibition on the export of colonial commodities to Britain or its other colonies. To enforce these sanctions, the Continental Congress urged that a committee be chosen in every county, city, and town, by those who are qualified to vote for representatives in the legislature, whose business it shall be attentively to observe the conduct of all persons. Known as Committees of Observation and Safety, these groups took over the functions of local government throughout the colonies. They organized militia companies, called extra-legal courts, and combined to form colony-wide congresses or conventions. By dissolving the colonial legislatures, royal governors had unwittingly aided the work of these committees. In addition to providing government, the committees also scrutinized the activities of fellow citizens, suppressed the expression of loyalist opinion from pulpit or press, and practiced other forms of coercion. Throughout the colonies, the committees, which began to link localities together in the cause of a wider American community, formed a bridge between the old colonial administrations and the revolutionary governments organized over the next few years. It was at this moment that people began for the first time to refer to the British colonies as the American states. 6.4.5 Lexington and Concord. On September 1, 1774, General Gage sent troops to seize stores of gunpowder and arms from several storehouses on the outskirts of Boston. In response, the Massachusetts House of Representatives, calling itself the Provincial Congress, created a committee of safety, empowered to call up the militia. On October 15 the committee authorized the creation of special units, to be known as Minutemen, who stood ready to be called at a moment's notice. The armed militia of the towns and communities surrounding Boston now opposed the British Army, quartered in the city. Worrying that his forces were insufficient to suppress the rebellion, Gage requested reinforcements. The stalemate continued throughout the fall and winter as he awaited instructions. British monarch George III believed the time for war had come. The New England governments are in a state of rebellion, he wrote, and blows must decide whether they are to be subject to this country or independent. In Virginia, at almost the same moment, Patrick Henry was predicting that hostilities soon would begin. Gentlemen may cry peace, peace, he thundered in prose later memorized by several generations of American schoolchildren, but there is no peace. Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. 3 weeks later, on April 14, 1775, General Gage received instructions to immediately strike against the Massachusetts militia. On the evening of April 18, Gage ordered 700 troops to Concord, some miles outside Boston, to take possession of the armory there. Learning of the operation, the Boston Committee dispatched 2 men, Paul Revere and William Dawes, to alert the militia of the countryside. By the time the British forces had reached Lexington, midway to their destination, some 70 armed Minutemen were assembled on the green in the center of town. They were disorganized and confused. No order to fire was given, but suddenly shots rang out spontaneously. 8 Americans were killed, 10 wounded. The British marched on to Concord, where they burned a small quantity of supplies and cut down a liberty pole. Meanwhile, news of the deaths at Lexington had spread throughout the surrounding countryside, and the militia companies from communities for miles around converged on the town. At a Concord bridge they encountered the enemy and opened fire. 3 regular soldiers were killed, the first British casualties. Seeing that their men were greatly outnumbered by Massachusetts militia, British officers immediately ordered a return to Boston, but at many points along the way they were subjected to withering fire. By the time the British force finally reached the city, 73 soldiers had been killed and 202 wounded. American losses were much lower. The engagement forecast what would be a central problem for the British: they would be forced to fight an armed population defending their own communities against outsiders. 6.5 Deciding for independence. What events led the Second Continental Congress to declare independence? Throughout the colonies, community militia companies mobilized for war. At Boston, thousands of militiamen besieged the city, leaving the British no escape but by sea. Meanwhile, delegates from 12 colonies converged again on Philadelphia. 6.5.1 The Second Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress, which opened on May 10, 1775, included representatives from 12 of the British colonies on the mainland of North America. Few conservatives or loyalists were among them. Georgia, unrepresented at the First Continental Congress, remained absent at the opening of the Second. It depended heavily on British subsidies, and its leaders were cautious, fearing both slave and Indian uprisings. But the political balance soon shifted in favor of the radicals in Georgia, and by the end of the summer the colony had sent delegates to Philadelphia. Among the men at the Congress were many familiar faces and a few new ones, including Thomas Jefferson, Virginia plantation master and lawyer, gifted with one of the most imaginative and analytical minds of his era. All the delegates carried news of the enthusiasm for war that raged in their home provinces. A frenzy of revenge seems to have seized all ranks of people, Jefferson observed. George Washington attended all the sessions in uniform. The delegates agreed that military defense was the most important issue on their agenda. On May 15 the representatives resolved to put the colonies in a state of defense but were divided on how best to do it. They lacked the power and the funds to raise and supply an army. John Adams made the winning proposal that they simply designate as a Continental Army the militia forces besieging Boston. In order to emphasize their national aspirations, they decided to select a man from the South to command those New England forces. On June 15 Jefferson and Adams nominated George Washington to be commander-in-chief, and he was elected by acclaim. On June 22, in a highly significant move, the Congress voted to finance the Army with an issue of $2 million in bills of credit, backed by the good faith of the Confederated colonies. During the early summer of 1775 the Congress began to move cautiously toward independence. On July 5, 1775, the delegates passed the so-called Olive Branch Petition, written by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, in which they professed their attachment to King George and begged him to prevent further hostilities so that there might be an accommodation. The next day they approved a Declaration of the Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms, written by Jefferson and Dickinson. In this the delegates adopted a harsher tone, resolving to die freemen rather than to live slaves. Before the Second Continental Congress adjourned at the beginning of August, the delegates appointed commissioners to negotiate with the Indian nations in an attempt to keep them out of the conflict. They also reinstated Benjamin Franklin as Postmaster General in order to keep the mails moving and protect communication among the colonies. 6.5.2 Canada and the Spanish borderlands. In one of their first acts, delegates called on the oppressed inhabitants of Canada to join in the struggle for common liberty. French Canadians felt little sympathy for the British, but the Americans were traditional enemies, much feared because of their aggressive expansionism. Indeed, when the Canadians failed to respond positively and immediately, the Congress reversed itself and voted to authorize a military expedition against Quebec to eliminate any possibility of a British invasion from that quarter, thus killing any chance of the Canadians joining the anti-British cause. This set a course toward the development of the separate nations of the United States and Canada. In the British island colonies, there was at first considerable sympathy for the American struggle. The legislative assemblies of Jamaica, Grenada, and Barbados declared themselves in accord with the Continental Congress. But the British Navy prevented them from sending representatives. The island colonies would remain aloof from the imperial crisis, largely because the colonists there were dependent on a British military presence to guard against slave revolts. Things at first seemed more promising in Nova Scotia, where many New Englanders had relocated after the expulsion of the Acadians. There had been Stamp Act demonstrations in Halifax, and when the British attempted to recruit among the Nova Scotians for soldiers to serve in Boston, one community responded that since almost all of us born in New England, divided betwixt natural affection to our nearest relations and good faith and friendship to our king and country. The British naval stronghold at Halifax, however, secured the province for the Empire. Large contingents of British troops also kept Florida solidly in the Empire. In Cuba, some 3,000 exiled Spanish Floridians, who had fled there in 1763 rather than live under British rule, now clamored for Spain to take advantage of the situation and retake their homeland. Many of them were active supporters of American independence. Spanish colonial authorities, who also administered the newly acquired colony of Louisiana, were conflicted. They certainly felt no solidarity with the cause of the American rebels, whom they thought threatened the idea of monarchy and empire. But with painful memories of the British invasion of Havana in 1763, they looked forward to the prospect of taking revenge on their traditional enemy, as well as regaining control of the Floridas and eliminating the British threat to their Mexican and Caribbean colonies. In 1775, Spain publicly declared itself neutral but secretly searched for an opportunity to support the Americans. One presented itself in the late spring of 1776 when a contingent of Americans arrived in Spanish New Orleans via the Mississippi River bearing a proposal from Patriot forces in Virginia. British naval supremacy was making it impossible to obtain supplies from overseas. Would the Spanish be willing to quietly sell guns, ammunition, and other provisions to the Americans in New Orleans and allow them to be shipped by way of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers? If the Spanish could be cooperative, the Americans might agree to a Spanish protectorate of the Floridas. The Spanish government eventually approved the plan, turning Havana and New Orleans into important supply centers for the Americans. 6.5.3 Fighting in the North and South. Violent conflict took place between British forces and American rebels in both the northern and southern colonies in 1775 and early 1776. On the evening of May 10, 1775, a small force of armed New Englanders, jointly commanded by Ethan Allen of Vermont and Benedict Arnold of Connecticut, surprised the British garrison at Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain. One account had Allen hailing the British commander, still in his nightshirt, "Come out of there, you damned old bastard." By whose authority, the commander shouted back. "In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress," Allen thundered. In fact, Allen was a notorious atheist, and the Congress knew nothing of this campaign. At Boston, the British reinforced Gage's forces, and by the middle of June had approximately 6,500 soldiers in the city. They were besieged by more than 10,000 New England militia. Fearing a move by Gage to occupy the heights south of town, the Americans made a countermove, occupying the Charlestown Peninsula on the north. Gage decided on a frontal assault to dislodge them. In bloody fighting at Breeds and Bunker Hill, the British overran the Americans, killing 140 men, but not before suffering more than 1,000 casualties of their own, including 226 dead. The fierce patriotic reaction in England to this enormous loss ended any possibility of a last-minute reconciliation. In August 1775, King George refused to hear the Olive Branch petition and issued a royal proclamation declaring the colonists in open and avowed rebellion. In June, Congress assembled an expeditionary force against Canada. 1,000 Americans moved north up the Hudson River corridor, and in November General Richard Montgomery forced the capitulation of Montreal. In the meantime, Colonel Benedict Arnold set out from Massachusetts with another American army and joined Montgomery outside the walls of Quebec. But the American assault failed to take the city. By the summer of 1776 the Americans had been forced back from Canada. There were successes elsewhere. In the South, local militias rose against the loyalist forces of Virginia's Governor Dunmore, who alienated the planter class by promising freedom to any slave who would fight with the British. The next month, the North Carolina rebel militia crushed a loyalist force at the Battle of Moore's Creek Bridge near Wilmington, ending British plans for an invasion there. The British elected to attack Charlestown, but an American force turned back the assault. It would be more than 2 years before the British would try to invade the South again. At Boston, Washington installed the British artillery captured at Fort Ticonderoga on the heights south of town, placing the city and harbor within cannon range. The British had little choice but to evacuate. In March 1776 they sailed out of Boston harbor heading northeast to Halifax, accompanied by at least 1,000 American loyalists. 6.5.4 No turning back. Any hope of reconciliation died. With the mounting casualties, the Second Continental Congress, rapidly assuming the role of a general government for all the colonies, now called the States, reconvened in Philadelphia in September 1775. Although the Congress continued to disclaim any intention of denying the sovereignty of the king, it now moved to organize an American navy, and declared British vessels open to capture. The Congress took further steps toward independence when it authorized contacts with foreign powers through its agents in Europe. In the spring of 1776, France joined Spain in approving the shipping of supplies to the rebellious provinces. The Continental Congress then declared colonial ports open to the trade of all nations but Britain. But the emotional ties to Great Britain proved difficult to break. Help arrived in January 1776 with the publication of the pamphlet Common Sense, in which Thomas Paine proposed to offer simple fact, plain argument, and common sense on the crisis. Paine, a radical Englishman recently arrived in Philadelphia, argued that for years Americans had defended their actions by wrapping themselves in the mantle of British tradition, but the British system rested on the base remains of two ancient tyrannies, aristocracy and monarchy, neither of which was appropriate for America. He placed the blame for the oppression of the colonists on the shoulders of George III. Common Sense was the single most important piece of writing during the Revolutionary era, selling more than 100,000 copies within a few months of its publication. It reshaped popular thinking and put independence squarely on the agenda. In April, the North Carolina Convention became the first to empower its delegates to the Continental Congress to vote for independence. In May, the Congress voted to recommend that the individual states move as quickly as possible toward the adoption of state constitutions. In the preamble to this statement, John Adams wrote that the exercise of every kind of authority under the said crown should be totally suppressed. This sent a strong signal that the delegates were on the verge of approving a momentous declaration. 6.5.5 The Declaration of Independence. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia offered the first motion for independence, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. After some debate, a vote was postponed until July, but a committee composed of John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert Livingston of New York was asked to prepare a draft Declaration of American Independence. The committee assigned the writing of a first draft to Jefferson. The intervening time allowed the delegates to debate and receive instructions from their state conventions. By the end of the month, all the states but New York had authorized a vote for independence, and when the question came up for debate again on July 1, there was a large majority in support. The final vote, taken on July 2, was 12 in favor of independence, none against, with New York abstaining. The delegates then turned to the Declaration itself and made a number of changes in Jefferson's draft, striking out, for example, a long passage condemning slavery. The first section of the Declaration expressed the highest ideals of the delegates. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form, as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. There was very little debate over this extraordinary statement. John Adams later noted that Jefferson had put into elegant language what nearly every delegate already believed. The unanimity was the result of the widespread influence of Enlightenment and Republican thought. Notably, there was no recourse to biblical authority. The delegates, mostly men of wealth and position, realized that the coming struggle for independence would require the steady support of ordinary people, and thus they asserted this great principle of equality and the right of revolution. There was little debate about the implications or the potential consequences. The statement of principles would resonate throughout subsequent American history. The ideal of equality would inspire the poor as well as the wealthy, women as well as men, blacks as well as whites. It was the final section of the Declaration, however, that may have contained the most meaning for the delegates themselves, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. By voting for independence, not only were these men proclaiming a belief in their newly conceived national community, but they were also committing treason against their king and empire. They would be condemned as traitors, hunted as criminals, and might stand on the scaffold in payment for their actions. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted. Without dissent. Conclusion: Great Britain emerged from the 7 Years' War as the dominant power in North America. Yet despite its attempts at strict regulation and determination of the course of events in its colonies, it faced consistent resistance. The British underestimated the political consensus that existed among the colonists about the importance of republican government. They also underestimated the ability of the colonists to inform one another, to work together, and to build the bonds of national community cutting across boundaries of ethnicity, region, and economic condition. Through newspapers, pamphlets, committees of correspondence, community organizations, and group protest, the colonists discovered the concerns they shared, and in so doing fostered a new American identity. Without that identity, it would have been difficult for them to consent to the treasonous act of declaring independence, especially when the independence they sought was from an international power that dominated much of the globe. Chapter: The American Revolution. 1776, 1786. American communities. A national community evolves at Valley Forge. A drum roll announced the dawn of a cold January morning in 1778. Along a 2-mile line of rude log cabins, doors slowly opened and the ragged men of the Continental Army stepped out onto the frozen ground of Valley Forge. The reek of unwashed bodies and foul straw filled the air. No bread, no soldier. The chant began as a barely audible murmur, then was picked up by men all along the line. No bread, no soldier. No bread, no soldier. At last the chanting grew so loud it could be heard at General Washington's headquarters, a mile away. The 11,000 men of the American Army were surviving on little more than fire cake, a mixture of flour and water baked hard before the fire. 2,000 men were without shoes, others were without blankets and had to sit up all night about the fires to keep from freezing. After suffering a series of shattering defeats at the hands of a British force nearly twice their number, the soldiers of the Continental Army straggled into winter headquarters in this valley, some 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia, only to find themselves at the mercy of indifferent local suppliers. Congress refused to pay the exorbitant rates demanded by contractors for food and clothing. Local farmers preferred to deal with the British, who paid in pounds sterling rather than depreciated continental currency. The 11,000 men of the Continental Army were divided into 16 brigades composed of regiments from the individual states. Many were drawn from the ranks of the poor and disadvantaged. They included landless tenant farmers, indentured servants, and nearly 1,000 African Americans, both slave and free. A majority of the men came from rural districts or small towns, places where precautions regarding sanitation were unnecessary. Every thaw that winter revealed ground covered with much filth and nastiness, and officers ordered sentinels to fire on any man easing himself elsewhere than at the vaults. Such conditions bred infectious epidemic diseases like typhoid that spread quickly among men already weakened by malnutrition, dysentery, and exposure. Some 2,500 men died that winter. Yet the army that marched out of Valley Forge 5 months later was considerably stronger for its experience there. As 20th-century psychologists learned from studying the experiences of soldiers in World War II, it is the spirit of community among fighting men that contributes most to their success in battle. The men of the Continental Army spent the late winter and spring drilling under the strict discipline of Friedrich Wilhelm Augustus von Steuben, a Prussian officer who came to America to volunteer for the American cause. They were already resilient and tough, now they learned how to fight as a unit. But most important were the bonds forged among the men. Thrown together under the most trying of circumstances, men from different localities and ethnic backgrounds found a common identity in their struggle. On May Day they celebrated the end of winter and the coming of spring by raising maypoles before the cabins of each state regiment. Led by a sergeant decked out as King Tammany, the great Delaware chief of American folklore, and accompanied by 13 honor guards representing each of the states, the men paraded through the rough streets of camp, pausing at each maypole to dance together. It was a ritual of their new sense of national community. To some American patriots, as the supporters of the Revolution called themselves, the European-style Continental Army betrayed the revolutionary ideals of the citizen soldier and the autonomy of local communities. Washington argued strongly, however, that the revolution could not be won without a national army insulated from politics and able to withstand shifts in the popular mood. Moreover, during the critical period of the nation's founding, the Continental Army acted as a popular democratic force, counterbalancing the conservatism of the new republic's elite leadership. The national spirit built at places like Valley Forge sustained the fighting men through years of war and provided momentum for the long process of forging a national political system out of the persistent localism of American politics. The soldiers of the Continental Army were among the first of their countrymen to think of themselves as Americans. The Revolutionary years were characterized by warfare not only between armed American and British forces but also between patriots and loyalists, settlers and Indians, masters and slaves. Jealous of their autonomy, the individual colonies shaped a weak central government that just barely managed to keep them unified. The glue that held Americans together during this long struggle was the sense of national community. That emerged in places like Valley Forge during the winter of July 1, 1777. The War for Independence. What were the major alignments and divisions among Americans during the American Revolution? At the beginning of the Revolution, the British had the world's best equipped and most disciplined army, as well as a navy that was unopposed in American waters. But this overwhelming force encouraged them to greatly underestimate the American capacity to fight. With a native officer corps and considerable experience in the colonial wars of the 18th century, Patriot forces proved formidable. The British also misperceived the sources of the conflict. Seeing the rebellion as the work of a small group of disgruntled conspirators, they defined their objective as defeating this Patriot opposition. They believed that in the wake of a military victory they could easily reassert political control. But the geography of eastern North America offered no single vital center whose conquest would end the war. When the British succeeded in defeating the Patriots in one area, resistance would spring up in another. The key factor in the outcome of the War for Independence was popular support for the American cause. 7.1.1 The Patriot forces most American men of fighting age had to face the call to arms. From a population of approximately 350,000 eligible men, more than 200,000 saw action. About half served in the Continental Army under Washington's command, the other half in militia companies. These militias, armed bodies of men drawn from local communities, proved important in the defense of their own areas, for they had homes as well as local reputations to protect. But the revolution was not won by citizen soldiers. In the exuberant days of 1776, many patriots hoped that militias alone could win the war against the British. But serving short terms of enlistment, often with officers of their own choosing, militiamen resisted discipline. Indeed, in the face of battle, militia companies during the Revolution demonstrated appalling rates of desertion. The final victory resulted primarily from the steady struggle of the Continental Army. Washington and his officers wanted a force that could directly engage the British, and from the beginning of the war, he argued that victory could be won only with a full commitment to a truly national army. His views conflicted with popular fears of a standing army. Led by such views, Congress initially refused to invoke a draft or mandate army enlistments exceeding 1 year. But the failings of the militias in the early battles of the war sobered Congress, and it responded with greatly enlarged state quotas for the Continental Army and terms of service that lasted for the duration of the conflict. To spur enlistment, Congress offered bounties, regular wages, and promises of free land after victory. By the spring of 1777, Washington's army had grown to nearly 9,000 men. A wide chasm separated the officer corps from the rank and file in the Continental Army. Officers came from propertied and socially prominent families and considered themselves gentlemen, while enlisted men came mainly from the economically deprived and socially marginal elements of the population. The New England militia companies that made up the original core of the Continental Army included a small number of African Americans. But in late 1775, under pressure from Southern delegates, the Continental Congress barred them from enlistment. What changed this policy was the British promise of liberty for all slaves who fought for the crown, first offered by Virginia's royal governor John Murray, Earl of Dunmore. Thousands of slaves fled their masters and enlisted, forcing the states of the Upper South, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, to admit free persons of color and even slaves into the ranks. By war's end, at least 5,000 African Americans had served in Patriot militias or the Continental Army, and in the Upper South some slaves won their freedom through military service. In the Lower South, however, where the numerical superiority of slaves inspired fears of rebellion among whites, there was no similar movement. The Continental Army played an important political role during the war. At a time when Americans identified most strongly with their local communities or their states, the Continental Army, through experiences like the Valley Forge Winter, evolved into a powerful force for nationalist sentiment. More than 100,000 men from every state served in the Continental Army, contributing mightily to the unity of purpose, the formation of a national political community that was essential to the process of nation-making. 7.1.2 The toll of war. The best estimate is that 25,324 American men died in the fighting. Approximately 6,800 from wounds suffered in battle, most of the rest from the effects of disease. But since these numbers include only the major battles, the total death toll must have been considerably higher. The Continental Army experienced the heaviest casualty rates, losses in some regiments approaching 40%. Indeed, the casualty rate overall was higher than in any other American conflict except the Civil War. In New England and the Mid-Atlantic states, the war claimed few civilian lives, for it was confined largely to direct engagements between armies. In the South and backcountry, however, where Patriot and Loyalist militias waged violent and often vicious campaigns, there were many non-combatant casualties. There are no overall statistics for Loyalist casualties, but British forces suffered at least 10,000 killed or wounded in the major battles of the war. 7.1.3 The Loyalists. Not all Americans were patriots. Between a fifth and a third of the population, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, remained loyal to the British Crown. They called themselves Loyalists but were known to patriots as Tories, the popular name for the Conservative Party in England, traditionally supporters of the King's authority over that of Parliament. A large proportion of the Loyalists were relatively recent migrants to the colonies, born in England, Scotland, or Ireland. Others, such as royal office holders or Anglican clergymen, were dependent on the British government for their salaries. Many Loyalists were men of conservative temperament, fearful of political or social upheaval. Loyalists were particularly strong in some colonies. They were nearly a majority in New York and were so numerous in Pennsylvania that an officer of the Continental Army described that colony as the enemy's country. In Georgia, Loyalists made up such a large majority that the colony would probably have abandoned the revolutionary movement had the British not surrendered at Yorktown in 1781. Patriots passed state treason acts that prohibited speaking or writing against the revolution. They also punished Loyalists by issuing bills of attainder, a legal process by means of which Loyalists were deprived of civil rights and property. In some areas, notably New York, South Carolina, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, Loyalists faced mob violence. The British strategy for suppressing the revolution depended on mobilizing the Loyalists, as many as 50,000 of whom took up arms for Great Britain. Many joined Loyalist militias or engaged in irregular warfare, especially in the Lower South. In 1780, when Washington's army numbered about 9,000, some 8,000 American Loyalists were serving in the British Army in America. As many as 80,000 Loyalists fled the country during and after the Revolution. Many went to England or the British West Indies, but the largest number settled in the northern British colonies that would later become the nation of Canada. Some 4,000 former slaves who fought for the British settled near Halifax in Nova Scotia, where they formed the largest independent black community outside Africa. Most were unhappy exiles. I earnestly wish to spend the remainder of my days in America, William Pepperell, formerly of Maine, wrote from London in 1778. I love the country. I love the people. Despite their disagreement with the Patriots on essential political questions, they remained Americans, and they mourned the loss of their country. Among those exiles was the most infamous American supporter of the British cause, Benedict Arnold. Arnold was a hero of the early battles of the Revolution on the Patriot side, but in 1779, resentful of what he perceived to be humiliating assignments and rank below his station, he became a paid informer of the British. In 1780, Patriots uncovered Arnold's plot to betray the strategic post of West Point, which he commanded. He fled to the British, who paid him a handsome stipend and pension. Arnold moved to London after the war, where he died in 1801, impoverished and unknown. But Arnold's name remained well known in the United States, where it is still synonymous with treason. 7.1.4 Women and the war. As men marched off to war, thousands of women assumed the management of farms and businesses. Some women participated even more directly in Patriot politics. Mercy Otis Warren, sister of the Massachusetts leader James Otis, turned her home into a center of Patriot political activity and published a series of satires supporting the American cause and scorning the Loyalists. Thousands of women volunteered to support the war effort by working as seamstresses, nurses, even spies. Thousands of women also traveled with the armies of both sides. Some camp followers were prostitutes, but most were wives, nurses, cooks, and laundresses. In sharp contrast to the wives of officers who rode in coaches or wagons and were put up in the best available housing, working women were consigned to the back of the line with the baggage. These women not only shared the hardships of the soldiers but also were on the battlefields, bringing water, food, and supplies to the front lines under withering cannon and musket fire and nursing the wounded and dying. Tales were told of Molly Pitcher, a woman who carried water to thirsty fighters on the front lines and took her husband's place at the cannon when he was killed by shrapnel. Molly was a composite figure of folklore, inspired by the actions of real women. The Continental Congress and state legislatures awarded pensions to numerous women wounded in battle, to Margaret Corbin, struck while filling in for her mortally wounded husband, to Mary Hayes Macaulay, known to soldiers as SGT Macaulay, and to Anna Maria Lane, wife of a Connecticut enlisted man, who, in the garb and with the courage of a soldier, performed extraordinary military services and received a severe wound at the Battle of Germantown. According to one estimate, several hundred women dressed themselves as men and enlisted. One of them, Deborah Sampson of Massachusetts, was the subject of a sensational biography after the war and became the first American woman to embark on a lecture tour. 7.1.5 The campaign for New York and New Jersey during the winter of 1775-1776, the British developed a strategic plan for the war. From his base at Halifax, Sir William Howe would take his army to New York City, which the British Navy would protect. From there Howe was to drive north along the Hudson, while another British army marched south from Canada. The two armies would converge at Albany, cutting New England off from the rest of the colonies, and then turn eastward. Washington, in command of Patriot forces at Boston, shifted his forces southward toward New York in the spring of 1776. In early July, as Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, the British began their operation by landing 32,000 troops on Staten Island. The Patriots set up fortified positions across the harbor in Brooklyn. In late August the British attacked, inflicting heavy casualties. The Battle of Long Island ended in disaster for the Patriots, and they were forced to withdraw across the East River to Manhattan. The British then offered Congress an opportunity to negotiate, and on September 6, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Edward Rutledge sat down on Staten Island with General Howe and his brother, Admiral Richard Howe. But the meeting broke up when the Howes demanded repeal of the Declaration of Independence. 6 days later, the British invaded Manhattan, and only a desperate American stand at Harlem Heights prevented the destruction of a large portion of the Patriot Army. In a series of battles over the next few months, they forced Washington back at White Plains and overran the American posts of Fort Washington and Fort Lee, on either side of the Hudson River. By November, the Americans were fleeing south across New Jersey. With morale desperately low, whole militia companies deserted. American resistance seemed to be collapsing. Washington decided to risk a counterattack. On Christmas night 1776, Washington led 2,400 troops back across the Delaware, and the next morning defeated the Hessian forces in a surprise attack on their headquarters at Trenton, New Jersey. The Americans inflicted further heavy losses on the British at Princeton, then drove them all the way back to the environs of New York City. These victories had little strategic importance, but they salvaged American morale. As Washington settled into winter headquarters at Morristown, he realized he had to pursue a defensive strategy, avoiding direct confrontations with the British while checking their advances and hurting them wherever possible. The most important thing would be the survival of the Continental Army. 7.1.6 The Northern Campaigns of 1777 The fighting with American forces prevented Howe from moving north up the Hudson River, and the British advance southward from Canada was stalled by American resistance at Lake Champlain. In 1777, however, the British decided to replay their strategy. From Canada they dispatched General John Burgoyne with nearly 8,000 British and Allied German troops. Howe was to move his force from New York, first taking the city of Philadelphia, the seat of the Continental Congress, and then moving north to meet Burgoyne. Fort Ticonderoga fell to Burgoyne on July 6, but by August the general found himself bogged down and harassed by Patriot militias. After several defeats in September at the hands of an American army commanded by General Horatio Gates, Burgoyne retreated to Saratoga. There he was surrounded by a considerably larger force of Americans, and on October 18 he surrendered his army. It would be the biggest British defeat until Yorktown, decisive because it forced the nations of Europe to recognize that the Americans had a fighting chance to win their revolution. The Americans were less successful against Howe. A force of 15,000 British troops left New York in July and landed a month later at the northern end of Chesapeake Bay. In September, at Brandywine Creek outside Philadelphia, the British outflanked the Americans, inflicting heavy casualties and forcing a retreat. 10 days later they routed the Americans a second time at Paoli, clearing the way for the British occupation of Philadelphia on September 26. Congress fled to the Pennsylvania country town of York. Washington attempted a valiant counterattack at Germantown on October 4, but initial success was followed by a lack of coordination that eventually doomed the operation. After this campaign, the Continentals headed into winter quarters at Valley Forge, the bitterness of their defeats muted somewhat by news of Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga. The British had possession of Philadelphia, the most important city in North America, but it would prove of little strategic value to them. The Continental Congress continued to function, so the unified effort suffered little disruption. At the end of 2 years of fighting, despite numerous military victories, the British strategy for suppressing the revolution had been a failure. 7.1.7 A global conflict during these 2 years of fighting, the Americans were sustained by loans from France and Spain, traditional enemies of Great Britain. Both saw an opportunity to win back North American territories lost as a result of the 7 Years' War. Seeking more support, the Continental Congress sent a diplomatic delegation to Paris headed by Benjamin Franklin. The French foreign minister, Comte de Vergennes, longed to weaken the British Empire any way he could and was inclined to support the Americans. But he was reluctant to encourage a republican revolution against monarchy and colonialism. The American victory at Saratoga, and the fear that Great Britain might enter into negotiations with the revolutionaries, persuaded Vergennes to recognize American independence in December 1777. In the treaty signed by the 2 nations, the French pledged to maintain effectually the liberty, sovereignty, and independence of the United States, while the United States promised to recognize French acquisitions of British island colonies in the West Indies. Americans also found much support in the Netherlands. Although officially allied with Great Britain, the Dutch maintained a position of neutrality and opened secret negotiations with the Americans for a treaty of trade and friendship. Clandestine trade through the Dutch island of St. Eustatius in the Caribbean helped sustain the Patriot cause. In 1779 the British shelled the Dutch colony and the next year declared war on the Netherlands. The Dutch became the second European nation to recognize the United States, and its financiers became the most important source of loans for the new nation. Spain had entered the war in 1779. As early as 1775, Spanish officials in New Orleans were providing substantial ammunition and provisions for American forts in the West. But unlike France and the Netherlands, the Spanish refused to establish a formal alliance with the United States. They viewed the revolution as an opportunity to regain Florida from the British and extend their control of the Mississippi Valley, but they feared the threat the Americans would pose to New Spain. Its people are active, industrious, and aggressive, one official in Mexico wrote of the new nation, and it would be culpable negligence on our part not to thwart their schemes for conquest. Thus, the Spanish pursued an independent strategy against the British, seizing the weakly defended Mississippi River towns of Natchez and Baton Rouge in 1779, and winning the important Gulf ports of Mobile in 1780 and Pensacola in 1781. Alarmed by the quick spread of American settlements west of the Appalachians, the Spanish sent an expedition into the northwest that in 1781 succeeded in taking the minor British post of St. Joseph, in present-day Michigan. With France and Spain now in the war, the British rethought their military strategy. Considering their West Indies sugar colonies at risk, they shipped 5,000 troops from New York to the Caribbean, where they succeeded in beating back a French attack. Fearing the arrival of the French fleet along the North American coast, the new British commander in America, General Henry Clinton, evacuated Philadelphia in June 1778. Washington's Continentals, fresh out of Valley Forge, went in hot pursuit. In the Battle of Monmouth, fought in stifling New Jersey heat on June 28, the British blunted the American drive and succeeded in making an orderly retreat to New York City. After a failed American-French joint campaign against the British at Newport, Rhode Island, Washington decided on a defensive strategy. Although the Americans enjoyed several small successes in the Northeast over the next 2 years, the war there went into a stalemate. 7.1.8 Indian peoples and the revolution in the West. At the beginning of the conflict, both sides looked for Indian support. Most important was the stance of the Iroquois Confederacy, long one of the most potent political forces in colonial North America. A delegation from Congress told the Iroquois that the conflict was a family quarrel and urged them to keep out of it. British agents, on the other hand, pressed the Iroquois to unite against the Americans. Ultimately, however, the British proved persuasive. It became clear to Indians that a Patriot victory would mean the extension of American settlements into their homelands. Native peoples fought in the Revolution for some of the same reasons Patriots did, for political independence, cultural integrity, and the protection of their land and property, but Indian fears of American expansion led them to oppose the Patriot rhetoric of natural rights and the equality of all men. Almost all the tribes that engaged in the fighting did so on the side of the British. British officials marshaled the support of Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, and Chickasaws in the South, supplying them with arms from the British arsenal at Pensacola until it was seized by the Spanish in 1781. The consequence was a ferocious Indian war in the southern backcountry. In the summer of 1776, a large number of Cherokees, led by the warrior chief Dragging Canoe, attacked dozens of American settlements. It required hard fighting before Patriot militia companies managed to drive the Cherokees into the mountains. Among the Iroquois of New York, the Mohawk leader Joseph Brant succeeded in bringing most Iroquois warriors into the British camp, although he was opposed by the chiefs of the Oneidas and Tuscaroras, who supported the Patriots. In 1777 and 1778, Iroquois and Loyalist forces raided the northern frontiers of New York and Pennsylvania. In retaliation, an American army invaded the Iroquois homelands in 1779. Supported by Oneida and Tuscarora warriors, the Americans destroyed dozens of western villages and thousands of acres of crops. For the first time since the birth of their confederacy centuries before, the Iroquois were fighting each other. Across the mountains, the Ohio Indians formed an effective alliance under the British at Detroit, and in 1777 and 1778 they sent warriors south against pioneer communities in western Virginia and Kentucky that had been founded in defiance of the proclamation of 1763. Virginian George Rogers Clark countered by organizing an expedition of Kentucky militia against the old French settlements in the Illinois country, which were controlled by the British. They succeeded in taking the British post at Kaskaskia in the summer of 1778, and in early 1779, they captured Colonel Henry Hamilton, British commander in the West. But Clark lacked the strength to attack the strategic British garrison at Detroit. Coordinating his Iroquois forces with those in Ohio, Brant mounted a new set of offensives that cast a shadow over Clark's successes. Raids back and forth across the Ohio River by Indians and Americans claimed hundreds of lives over the next 3 years. The war in the West would not end with the conclusion of hostilities in the East. With barely a pause, the fighting in the Trans-Appalachian West between Americans and Indians would continue for another 2 decades. 7.1.9 The war in the South. The most important fighting of the Revolution took place in the South. General Clinton regained the initiative for Britain in December 1778 by sending a force from New York against Georgia, the weakest of the colonies. The British crushed the Patriot militia at Savannah and began to organize the Loyalists in an effort to reclaim the colony. Encouraged by their success in Georgia, the British decided to apply the lessons learned there throughout the South. This involved a fundamental change from a strategy of military conquest to one of pacification. Territory would be retaken step by step, and then handed over to Loyalists who would reassert the Crown's authority. In October 1779, Clinton evacuated